The title of this presentation is The Scientific Worldview, a Systems Perspective. And like I said, the point of my talk is to shed light on the environmentally and socially interdependent aspects of the scientific train of thought. We have to see the synergy between all systems and make similar interconnected applications to our global economic system to take the first steps towards to applying the scientific methods for social concern. Our current social system functions in a massive disconnect with the natural world. And this is the core reason why there are so many global issues right now that are happening and are spiraling out of control, since everything is viewed, again, in isolation and treated as such, without realizing the consequences of failing to have a broader perspective and questioning the very socio-economic system itself. As world-renowned endocrinologist Hans Selye put it regarding scientific thought, he said that, quote, "It is not to see something first, but to establish solid connections between the previously known and the unknown that constitutes the essence of scientific discovery. It is this process of tying together which can best promote true understanding and real progress." And again, that's all about interconnections and putting things together as a synergistic viewpoint and systems-oriented thinking. In our world of growing crises, ecological, social, and economic, we can no longer afford to persist in problem resolution using the same outdated and ineffective methods of the past. And I'm going to try to elaborate the many benefits to looking at the world using a holistic and multidisciplinary viewpoint. One aspect of the scientific worldview has to do with the concept of dependent origination. As 21st century scientific inquiry has shown again and again, there's nothing that actually exists in separation or independently from other things, either in nature or even human social structures. Everything is in a nested set of relationships, just like the boundaries of our bodies that separate us from the natural world have been proven to be illusions through molecular engineering. We're all intermeshed into one gigantic system. So therefore, one cannot exist without the other. Martin Luther King once said, in a real sense, all life is interconnected. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are tied into a network of mutuality, a single garment of destiny. So when injustice is done to one, it is done to everyone. This is why the restoration of the environment as a whole must be recognized, not just for one nation, but for the entire planet. In today's world, most people have a good sense of right and wrong when it comes to moral virtues. They generally don't support acts of violence, institutional slavery, and indifference to our ecosystem. But however, these problems persist regardless, due to a lack of our awareness of larger order structural issues. And this is where systems thinking needs to come in and replace the narrow and localized point of view, which is all too common in our culture. We don't need morality, actually, but rather an acceptance of what technically works and what technically doesn't work. A major characteristic of the scientific worldview has to do with the symbiotic nature of the universe. Largely dismissed as common sense today by anyone you talk to, this understanding actually holds profound revelations for the way we think about ourselves, our beliefs, and our conduct. The term symbiotic is typically used in the context of interdependent relationships between biological species. However, the zeitgeist movement's context of the word is broader, relating to the interdependent relationship of everything, including all systems, living or non-living. So, as a final point to this section, I want to make it clear, very clear, that any system or value system that supports isolation and division is an unsustainable belief system, and the natural law resource-based economy is the closest concept that we've come to so far in terms of generating a worldview that is sustainable. Market synergism, socially maladaptive economic thought. So before we move on to the synergistic nature of the ecosystem that we live in, the Earth system, let's briefly review our economic system, socio-economic system. As the TZM has demonstrated through countless lectures and analysis, has made it very clear that the market system has inherent flaws that are built into its very design, and it is systemic in its disregard for the integrity of the environment, and as time moves forward, its continuation also results in social instability and human conflict on many levels. This system has in its core structure an inability to recognize or respect the laws of nature. Our global economy is driven by growth, as we all know, of the gross domestic product, or GDP. This growth is a continuous flow of energy and materials put forth to keep public and industrial facilities functioning. More growth means more jobs, more money to purchase goods and services. This aspect is built into the system. It's necessary for its survival. But as anyone should know with a rational thought, which unfortunately many economists don't, continuous growth of anything in a finite setting is impossible and it's unsustainable. This is just basic. Planet Earth is a finite system, and we can't have this mentality. And while many activist groups talk about the need to save the environment, what they fail to realize is that at the root of the ecological crises is not the actions of a corrupt set of corporations, but the fact that the majority of investments across the board by all nations are going towards industrial development and not sustainability, since growth is needed to keep the economy going, clearly. Maintaining balance and preservation through, the use of renewable energy, optimized recycling protocols, or strategic product design, hence slowing the rate of economic growth, is counter to the market system's inherent logic, and it will never be done on a large scale without collapsing the market altogether. Any way we look at it, solving problems indefinitely will always have a negative effect on GDP because it removes the need to service that problem, which also removes businesses that are created for that service. Therefore, inefficiency is tied into the system and is a main driver of profit. Obviously, this type of system can never be ecologically or socially sustainable, and despite this firm reality, growth, which has been a dominant factor of the economic system for the last 200 years, is still believed by most people you talk to as necessary for social progress. And there's no wonder why government and corporate leaders do what they can to stimulate growth. And these psychological and institutional motivations connect the population and the economic system through structural means. Again, that's why we need systems-oriented thinking to understand what's going on at a structural level, not an individual, isolated, localized perspective. And despite the false assumptions of politicians and economists, growth in our economic system has not and will not ever even close to slightly alleviate the rampant poverty of the world. On the contrary, growth exacerbates poverty and increases the gap between the rich and the poor. Even in the presence of enormous material growth, leading up to the year 1995, the average income ratio between the rich and the poor, 20% of the world, has increased from 30-to-1 ratio to a staggering 82-to-1 ratio. So obviously, running the same program harder or faster will not change the pattern as long as the structure is not revised. This is why we need systems thinking to detect what's going on at a systemic level. There are social structures that clearly widen the gap between the rich and the poor, and the evidence for this tendency to suppress the majority while benefiting the already wealthy and powerful is very clear. And it's called structural classism. It's a very, very important term that everybody should look into, structural classism. Due to this infinite growth model, we are also exceeding the productive or absorptive capacity of the world. Since there is a limit to how much we can extract resources and emit waste such as toxic substances and greenhouse gases, the waste which we emit back into the earth are normally absorbed and filtered through natural sinks. Among the sinks are the atmosphere, surface water bodies, landfills, plants, trees, and algae populations in the rainforests and oceanic coral reefs. The sources of these resources are extraction points such as mineral deposits, aquifers, and the stocks of nutrients in soils. And obviously, if we look, a crucial problem is that many sources are emptying and degrading, while at the same time many sinks are filling up or overflowing. And all the data regarding this indicates that the flows generated by this economic system cannot be maintained for much longer. Like I said before, it's probably about 200 years before we really come to tremendous extinction spans, if not already we're facing. But within the next 100 years, we're going to have serious problems coming up on the surface. What we have is a positive feedback loop, creating self-reinforcing change. And just to make it clear, a positive feedback loop does not necessarily mean positive results. It operates as a vicious cycle, and climate change is a perfect example. Emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere lead to higher temperatures, and in turn accelerate the melting of the Arctic tundra. As the tundra defrosts, it's going to release trapped methane, a potent greenhouse gas. that can boost temperatures even higher. So clearly the word positive feedback loop does not mean a favorable outcome, and global warming is the most deadly feedback loop. There's a loss of biodiversity, loss of support systems, a downward trend of synergistic natural systems that our economy is largely now dismantled and ruined. Therefore, instead of placing blame on governments and corporations, market capitalism itself must be addressed for its systemic effects. As Peter Joseph put it very clearly, quote, "The market has a detached perspective, viewing the earth as not as a source of life support, but as an inventory for exploitation." This is why posing for green solutions within the system is never going to work, ever, since it will diminish growth. Coming up with these hopeless in-the-box solutions is the result, again, of our limited dimensional perception and not the holistic mindset needed to take nature's totality into consideration. And another amusing solution used by the activist community is that of market regulation through the legal system. Contrary to libertarian philosophy, corruption and exploitation is obviously what works in this system. Money can and always will influence regulation in one way or the other. Since it is the lifeblood of the system, is a foundational element of what runs the structure. So, political influence is always going to be geared towards whoever funds it. Therefore, we can never, ever really have any kind of real, long-lasting change for the majority using the system, because, again, it's built into the system. Money basically counts as a vote. The business mindset, historically, has always overturned regulatory bodies. Business controls the government, and since the focus has to be on economic activity, the entire legal system is corrupted and only there to control the lower classes and enable this cancerous, carcinogenic growth. And this is why it's called the corruption-inducing synergy. That's what capitalism is, the corruption-inducing synergy. So any way we look at it, capitalism cannot be revised. It is an obsolete system, and it's about time we realized it. Part 2, market psychology, a failed social perspective. Man is the most complex of creatures, and for this reason, the most dependent of creatures. We pay for our advantages by the same number of dependencies, and I see the idea of independence as a form of mental poverty. Therefore, human needs and conditioning are the factors that society needs to consider when it comes to social arrangements. Free market capitalism has failed in every way to address human needs and eliminate social instability. It also promotes a primitive mental perspective of looking at human behavior as an isolated act of free will, and places moral responsibility onto the individual without taking the larger order causality of environmental influence into consideration. The punitive attitudes of the justice system has people who commit crimes placed into correctional facilities or prisons, despite the inconvenient reality that such corrective measures have not diminished aberrant behavior whatsoever. In the U.S., incarceration rates have increased by more than 800% since 1986. Yet still no one questions punishment as a deterrent to socially offensive behavior. The point is that the legal system makes us believe that corporate and personal behavior is a direct act of free will, and that, for example, a choice always exists with the individual committing the act of violence, whereas in reality, violence is a process. In order for society to function in a balanced manner, the causality of human behavior must be taken into consideration, and that's why, again, systems thinking comes into play. Contrary to the views that's perpetuated by and reinforced by the economic system, human needs and behavior do not just stop at the commonly observed basic level. We are biopsychosocial organisms affected by our environment symbiotically in complex ways. There are many studies currently that show the effects of stress on the behavior and of the individual and the immune system. And the results call for nothing short of a systematic overhaul of our social structure. A new discipline called psychoneuroimmunology has now matured to the point that there is a lot of evidence that shows that there's an intimate relationship that exists between the brain, the immune system, and the social and physical environment. Stress can be defined as a complicated cascade of biochemical responses to powerful emotional stimuli, and there are clear long-term effects of living in a highly and chronically stressful environment. During the 7 years, Gabor Mate was medical coordinator of the palliative care unit at Vancouver Hospital. He saw many patients with chronic illness who had histories of emotional repression. In fact, emotional repression is an ever-present factor in the cases of autoimmune disorders such as ALS and the like. A study done in 1969 looked at the role of psychological processes in multiple sclerosis patients from Israel and the United States. 85% of these patients experienced symptoms that were diagnosed as multiple sclerosis in the wake of recent highly stressful events. The nature of the stressor went anywhere from death of a loved one to a sudden loss of livelihood. And interestingly, increased responsibility at work was one of the key sources of stress, provoking feelings of inadequacy or failure. Depression, a mental state that is epidemic in America today, has created a rage for antidepressant medications. Again, but this is a limited dimensional perspective because it does not address the root cause of the issue, namely the unnecessary stresses of our financial system, which brings us to the many problems that this system creates, namely social hierarchy and inequality. Money is a scoring system for humanity, a life or death game of differential advantage that guarantees some will have more than others. This guaranteed inequality is corrosive to the health of society, clearly, and as well as its propensities for generating socially unstable behavior such as violence. Humans are, from an evolutionary standpoint, highly social organisms. We did not evolve as solitary creatures, but as social animals whose survival was contingent on powerful emotional connections with the family and tribe. Emotional and social relationships remain important biological influences from infancy through childhood and beyond, and independent self-regulation does not exist even in adulthood. So therefore, social interaction is a key built-in requirement for the development of the human brain. When we realize this, we see how in our society people are driven, all of us are really driven to preserve our social self and are vigilant to threats that may jeopardize our social esteem or status. This social status is largely based on others' perceptions of one's worth. Therefore, as far as factors that can have destructive consequences on one's sense of internal balance, inequality is one of the worst. Human beings are so sensitive to inequality that it can exert a major effect on the psychological and social well-being of the individual. Therefore, more importantly than looking at isolated incidents, again, we need to recognize how individuals are affected by the social structure within which they live. The relationships between inequality and poor health and social problems are too strong to be attributed to chance. Strong correlations between high inequality, and both violence and lowered health have been demonstrated a large number of times in quite different settings. As an example, when cocaine was made available to monkeys in a certain experiment, it was actually taken more by those who had lower social status. So as if to offset their lower dopamine activity because they felt inferior to the superior monkeys. In a lot of cases, they actually rejected food, and they would actually favor drugs because drugs, again, made them feel better about this terrible feeling of worthlessness. In one experiment, researchers manipulated the dominance relationship in groups of female monkeys. Some previously dominant monkeys were forced into subordination, while subordinate ones were put into positions of superiority. Females that were previously dominant secreted less of the stress hormone cortisol than those who were subordinate. When the experimental situation was altered so that dominant monkeys became subordinate, the cortisol production was almost immediately reversed. And the same goes with human beings. Maintaining a system of social hierarchy has a largely distorted effect on the health of the entire population. And the corporate executive, for example, that who's basically set for life, he's financially assured even when he's terminated from his job, may experience more stress than his coworker who actually had more connection with his family and social interest than actual investment, emotional investment into his job. So someone who's a millionaire who loses his job actually could feel more stress than someone who's like lower status economically, and he has more connections with his family and the community. As the book Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson has demonstrated, the impact of inequality and social problems, namely violence, is very clear to see. He states, Reckless and violent behavior often come from young men at the bottom of society who are deprived of all markers of status. They struggle to maintain faith with what little status they have, often reacting violently when it is threatened. In his book, Life Without Father, sociologist David Popenoe describes how 60% of America's rapists, 72% of juvenile murderers, and 70% of long-term prisoners grew up in fatherless homes. This is interesting, since single mothers with dependent children have the highest rate of poverty among all demographic groups. Approximately 60% of U.S. children living in mother-only families are impoverished, compared with only 11% of two-parent families. Inequality is such a significant factor that the national standards of health from years of research are substantially determined by the level of inequality in a society. So it's very clear that we can label the effects of inequality as structural violence, another key term that's used by the movement. It's very, very important. It's never really looked at. It's because most people look at things in an isolated perspective. So if we take a wider social perspective, what do we see? We see that solutions to the problems caused by inequality are clearly not massive amounts of psychotherapy and medication to make people less vulnerable to the effects of inequality, to the negative results of inequality. So the best way of responding to the harm done by high levels of inequality would be to reduce the inequality itself. This social viewpoint also makes it clear that differences in the quality of medical care have much less of an effect on people's life expectancy than social differences in the risk of getting some life-threatening disease to begin with. Our societies are endlessly creating these problems of violence and disease each new generation, and dealing with the symptoms clearly will not eliminate their source. Yet social problems tend to be treated by policymakers as if they're separate from one another, each needing separate remedies and services. Again, there's a limited sense of perception that the justice system engages in, and the last things that politicians will ever mention is the fact that the health and social problems, which have strong class correlations, become much more common further down the social hierarchy, as well as being more common in highly unequal societies. And one interesting study showed that there was a decrease in life expectancy in Eastern European countries following the collapse of the Soviet Union. From 1989 to 1995, among these countries, the greatest decrease in life expectancy took place in those which had the greatest income differences. So if people understood the consequences of inequality, they would be keener to prevent them. And when it comes to the environment now, how might greater equality have an effect on reducing carbon emissions? Well, since in the market system, decades of indoctrination have convinced people to think that the material possessions they own somehow represent their worth as human beings, and since social status is connected to someone's income and material worth, inequality clearly increases this hyper-competitive consumption. Everyone's seeking to boost their social status through displays of material wealth, and that's what drives the GDP. That's what drives consumption. So it looks as if not as if the two are complementary, but that governments cannot afford to make big enough cuts in carbon emissions without also reducing inequality. That's why greater equality gives us the crucial key to reducing the cultural pressure to consume, and hence preserve the environment. And this is a key point that I'm trying to make in regards to having a holistic social perspective. We must question the system of competitive consumption itself. The most comprehensive analysis of the various issues of international development to date is reported by the Independent Commission on International Development Issues in 1980, headed by the Chancellor of West Germany, William Brandt. The Brandt report has demonstrated to the world that social and environmental sustainability must go together. It makes a very valid case that inequality creates conflict, competition, and separation, and it also calls for a system that meets human needs at a minimum and eliminates the vast inequality that's so common in our culture today. And again, we need a systems perspective, and really that nothing out there demonstrates this idea of looking at a interconnected symbiotic system as studying nature itself. And we're going to go on to the main point of my presentation, which is planetary symbiosis. Again, I'm going to quote Hans Selye on this, and when it comes to interconnected systems thinking. He said that a perennial give and take has been going on between living matter and its inanimate surroundings, between one living being and another, since the dawn of life in the prehistoric oceans. So my question is, how is planet Earth habitable for life? On Venus, the carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere has turned the planet into an oven. And the thin atmosphere of Mars, low in carbon dioxide, makes the planet frigid. But on Earth, the oceans have not boiled away, even though the sun's intensity has increased by 25% since its formation. Something or some process has kept the temperature on Earth and the salt concentration in the oceans relatively constant. Environmental scientist James Lovelock explained this through the Gaia principle. His conclusion was that the interactions between all living organisms and their inorganic surroundings form some kind of like a self-regulating complex system that has contributed to maintaining the conditions for life on the planet. This is part of an automatic process, and the earthly system of life totally interconnected and where nothing exists in isolation. While early views of natural phenomenon have looked upon the manifestation of a tree as an independent entity, seemingly self-contained in its illusion of separation, the truth of the matter is that the tree's life is entirely dependent on external input forces for its existence. So the tree needs water, sunlight, nutrients, soil compression, and other interactive attributes to enable its growth. Hence, a symbiotic relationship. But the degree of this symbiosis, as demonstrated by our movement, makes it much more revealing that we must look at the universe as an interconnected system and all social interactions. There's a constant, immutable interdependency that exists. The universe is an immense system that is consisted of many subsystems. In our tree example, the root, the trunk, branches, leaves, and other parts of the tree could be called subsystems. Yet the tree itself is also a subsystem of a forest. The forest is a subsystem of a larger ecosystem. And even when we look at the Earth, seemingly autonomous and is floating in the void of space, the Earth itself is dependent on other external input forces, such as the sun and the moon, and many other symbiotic forces that we have yet to even understand. So on a social level, this system interaction understanding is at the foundation of likely the most viable perspective for human sustainability on the planet. The human being, like the earth or the tree, appears, again, self-contained, but again, without oxygen, without water, we cannot survive. This means the human system must require an atmospheric system, and hence a system of oxygen production. So it is to our advantage to be aware of this particular system and work to harmonize our activities with the system. So therefore, when we witness pollution or the rapid deforestation of the earth, we often forget how important such phenomena really are to the integrity of the human system. The failure to recognize this symbiosis and the principle of interacting systems is a fundamental problem. Albert Einstein understood this. He understood this science of interconnectedness pretty well. And in his famous quote, he stated, "A human being is part of a whole called by us the universe. A part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of a prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires for affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to clear ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures." So let's start with the interconnected of ourness in our bodies. For a long time, there was emphasis on the singular aspects of our different organs. But now we see that the human body is a distributed network of holistic responses to the world around us. No one part functions without the other. Our bodies, in turn, are really there to preserve internal balance with the outside world. For example, we possess an extraordinarily complex built-in safety measures finely attuned to obtain the right amount of air. If breathing is interrupted, most people suffer irreversible brain damage within 2 to 3 minutes. So therefore, oxygen chemoreceptors constantly monitor the level of oxygen in the blood. When oxygen levels fall, the receptors send out impulses to the muscles of the diaphragm and the ribs to increase the rate of breathing. When dehydration reduces the volume of blood in our bodies, stretch receptors monitor blood volume inside the heart, acting as biological alarms, sending signals to the thirst center of the hypothalamus in the brain to inhibit the production of saliva. So therefore, dryness settles into our mouth as registering as thirst, stimulating us to drink. Again, this system is very similar to the larger order ecosystem, a system of synergistic aspects working to sustain life on this planet. So let's move to the ecosystem. Natural ecosystems are complex due to their long evolutionary histories. They are consistent of three stages of living beings. At the bottom are producers, which are the plants and the algae, producing their own food through the use of the sun's energy. They are a source of energy for the primary consumers, such as herbivores, such as deer, zebra, gazelles. And at the top of the food chain are the secondary consumers, such as lions and us. And ecosystems are highly efficient at cycling energy through what could be called the pyramid of life. Energy, which is the currency of life and ecology, is most abundant at the base of the pyramid, and less and less energy is available as it moves to the upper echelons of the ladder, with predators having the least available energy. A vital element of an ecosystem is the complex web of co-evolutionary relationships that exist between the various species that keep the system intact. For example, there are predator-prey relationships, as we all know, that keep the system in a state of checks and balances, keeping the numbers of all organisms relatively constant so one does not overproduce and become a pest that could disturb the ecosystem's balance. Ecosystems are complex functioning units, like a nervous system. Every part has a role in maintaining the integrity of the whole. So therefore, the disappearance of one can have cascading effects on the others. An example is the sea otter of the North Pacific Ocean, which keeps the populations of sea urchins in check through predation to stop them from overgrazing on the algae and kelp forests. There are also ecosystem engineers, such as the beaver, building dams which expand the habitat of animals, creating biodiversity between lakes. The more life forms in an ecosystem, the more complex the interrelationships become and the healthier the environment. So, for example, a tree may survive due to many factors, such as insect pollination, monkeys spreading its seeds, birds to eat its pests, vegetation at the ground to keep the soil from eroding, and microbes to nourish its roots. So the extinction, again, of one species can have domino effect on the others. Areas rich in biodiversity also tend to be more productive in assimilating energy from the sun. And this productivity is seen in tropical areas such as the Amazon rainforest, which holds much higher biodiversity in proportion to other habitats. The value of the forest is not only in its biodiversity, but the many services it performs. Forests are known as carbon sinks for a reason, since their vegetation stores an amount of carbon equivalent to more than half of what is in the atmosphere. A single tree can absorb as much as 48 pounds of carbon dioxide per year and can sequester 1 ton of carbon dioxide by the time it reaches 40 years of age. It can also return about 100 gallons of groundwater to the atmosphere in one day, and therefore without trees and plants to cycle the water, areas where crops are grown will lose significant rainfall, leading to drought. The interactions between animals in such an ecosystem is remarkable. Certain forest species such as the rattan vines or mushrooms are sources of medicines, dyes, and food, yet cannot exist without the sheltering trees that form their habitat. Fungi also play an important role. They are critical to recycling organic matter, and 90% of all plant species are supported by their associations through soil fungi. The fungus stimulates the growth and produces antibiotics that can protect the plant from pathogens, but in return, the fungus benefits from receiving a steady supply of sugar, which its host synthesizes in its leaves. Plants would grow poorly, if not at all, without the support from the fungi. In the eucalyptus forest of the South Wales, it was found that truffles perform a service for the trees near which they're found. Because both truffles and trees extract water and minerals from the soil, trees with truffles in their roots obtain more water and minerals and grow better than those without the truffles. The truffles are also a favorite food of the long-footed potteroo, a marsupial animal which excretes the spores of the truffles and thereby enhances the health of the forest. Potteroo, truffle, eucalyptus, three very different species of animals, which by us, with our limited dimensional perception, we see them as different and separated, but they're all bound together in a remarkable web of cooperation. So, in a complex system such as the forest, feedback loops with unexpected consequences make a mockery of the market's simplistic notions and attempts to justify its ecologically dysfunctional activities. So, for example, everybody knows about mass monoculture farming system, where one variety of crop is grown. It has very little genetic diversity, leaving every plant in the field susceptible to the same hardships such as disease and drought. But again, it's done because it saves money. It's the mechanism of cost efficiency is looked at, and not the cost of the ecosystem. So therefore, again, we're working within systems and without stepping out, taking a couple of steps back to see what's really wrong on a holistic level. Moving on to other natural habitats, swamps, marshes, and coral reefs. They take the biggest impacts of storms that arrive at the ocean shore, and the extra runoff water is stored in swamps, which swamps have saved human civilizations many, many times over again. Their planned routes of networks and burrows act as disturbance regulators. Where you have them, the tsunami is broken, and the coastal populations and property are safe behind their protective shield. Coral reefs are the oldest ecosystem on the planet, as old as 2 billion years, and have survived eco-catastrophes as great as any that we can produce. So, they're home to a vast diversity of species, and their continued decline spells trouble for our survival. Grasslands, which have been an important part of our evolutionary niche, our upright stance, for example, was specifically adapted to the savanna. Natural grasslands provide carbon sinks like forests, but they hold most of the carbon in the soil. So grasslands all over the world have co-evolved with grazing animals, such as buffalo, antelopes, llamas, or kangaroos. And where grasses are eaten down by the grazers, the remaining stems and roots extract water and nutrients from the soil and send up more grass. So, but the thing is, again, this system of checks and balances, predation, seasonal migration, and disease keep these grazers in check. Therefore, the ecosystem does not erode. But due to our activities, we're removing predators, migrations are hindered, and the land is overstocked, and overall production of grazers can cut the grass down to the roots, which precipitates rapid erosion. And the less vegetation there is, the less cover there is, and we all know what happens with that. Land fertility spirals down until the grazing range has become a desert. And the last part of the ecosystem that I'm going to move on to is the ocean. The oceans are the circulatory systems of the earth. If you look at it as a nervous system, home to the hydrological cycle, the miraculous process that makes life possible, where salt water is absorbed, is transformed, into fresh water by evaporation, and is redistributed through the planet. Energy from the sun causes the water to evaporate, which rises into the atmosphere and then falls back down onto the land as precipitation. Water at the Earth's surface seeps into the ground or runs into lakes and eventually returns into the oceans. So living organisms are active participants in the hydrological cycle, absorbing and filtering water and breathing it back into the atmosphere. The importance of the ocean is realized through its source as a potential supplier of goods, and such as fiber, genetic resources, metals, materials, and energy production. The ocean is an essential part of the biosphere, a crucial factor in the carbon cycle, and marine plants annually produce 36 billion tons of oxygen, equal to 70% of oxygen in the atmosphere. So there's many more times carbon dioxide in the ocean than there is in the atmosphere. This CO2 retention is the reason why the temperature on the Earth is actually not scorching 780 degrees Fahrenheit like what we see on Venus. That's the main reason. So we need to maintain the richness of the oceans. But again, due to the prevalence of the market system, there's an acceleration of production and consumption beyond that of the carrying capacity of the oceans. Exactly, that's what will happen. A pop will go off, eventually, if we don't maintain preservation. Okay, melting of the exactly, yeah, You gotta maintain balance, man, you know? So the melting of the glaciers has become a chief threat to biodiversity, all the way down to the bottom of the food chain. You know, this affects the survival of fish populations, which are disappearing. The fish in turn feed the seals, and with fewer seals there is less food for the polar bears. The less polar bears, we all know where the chain of causality is, and a system such as the market, whose natural state is conflict and imbalance, cannot be compatible with the natural world, which demands equilibrium. So economists who are attempting to put economic value on everything that matters to us don't realize that an economy has to be connected to the real world. The vast services provided by nature, such as cleaning the air and water, pollinating plants, inhibiting erosion and flooding, building topsoil, and so on, are crucial to our survival. Yet conventional economics considers these gifts from nature as externalities, meaning that they're not included into their economic calculations, that's a huge, huge problem. So, from the forest and algae population serving as the lungs of the earth, to the hydrological cycle representing the flows of the lifeblood, the earth seems to function as one organism, very much in line with the Lovelock's interpretation of Gaia, as one living entity seeking to sustain its own life force. So we have to accept that the fact that life is highly interconnected, and there is no escape from our dependence on nature. Therefore, the profit scheme of doing everything within the mind frame of saving money at the cost of the environment is highly illogical and unsustainable. Therefore, we can't have this idea of a green business or a sustainable business. It's really, really not possible. You know, so anybody who tells you that they have a green business really sit them down and talk them through the aspects that really requires this market to go around. Again, you create a green business, you're generating growth in some way or whatsoever. You know, you're generating growth. So you have to basically look at the systems perspective. And this is my last part of my talk, which is called the systems application. And it's meant to provide I'm trying to provide a new angle of thought when it comes to the natural law resource-based economy. You know, there's a lot of information out there already on the details of the system, but I'm going to draw comparisons from the natural world. So in many ways, the RBE concept is the technological and sociological integration, what happens in nature every day, and human society needs to take that and move it over to our economic social structure, the synergistic biosphere. The natural world undergoes constant change. It maintains its own dynamic equilibrium and allows very little energy to go to waste, completely opposite of what we're doing today. So it is therefore ecologically efficient. So we need to become economically efficient by learning from the natural system. We must align with the natural dynamics of the physical world as a single species, sharing one habitat, increase efficiency and maximize prosperity for the entire population. So instead of isolated pockets of society fighting for their own self-benefit, the whole of society has to be taken care of. And with this in mind, we can see how the world economic divisions in the world today are not only a clear source of conflict, destabilization, and exploitation, but their mechanisms are grossly inefficient in a pure economic sense, limiting our societal potential. We could find a lot of purpose in moving away from these modes of conduct and benefit as a whole group. So what is an economic model? As TZM defined text explains, quote, an economic model is a theoretical construct representing component processes by a set of variables or functions describing the logical relationships between them. In simpler terms, it's basically, again, taking different systems, putting them together, integrating them. Again, interconnectedness. And the best way to go about creating this kind of system is through scientifically oriented systems thinking. To take the social system, the ecosystem, and all other subsystems into consideration, integrate them into what's called the generalized governing principles, which are foundational characteristics or assumptions about what governs an entire system. The growing database of knowledge over the last couple hundreds of years has really made it clear that there are, in fact, governing principles, completely devoid of interpretation, of subjective interpretation, that apply to all known systems in the universe. And the systems worldview uses these principles to recognize the immutable interconnectedness, independence, and co-responsibility of everything in our world. And once again, when it comes to systems thinking, traditional cultural notions based on human or social divisions like race, loyalty, class, creed, nation states, are all born from a world ignorant from this interconnected reality, and it will create nothing but chaos and confusion in the long run. So realizing to think, within interconnected systems is critical for intellectual development. A natural law resource-based economy is driven by economic factors that are relevant to the real world and human society. So in our new economy, the factors that are actually really important are things like public health, resource preservation, and the state of social and technological progress. And if we look over at our traditional market, what do we see? We see that there's a big focus on terms like GDP growth, price trends, inflation, the labor market, or currency fluctuation. And rarely is anything ever said about public or ecological health as a standard of economic progress. And why is that? That's because the market is life-blind and decoupled from the actual science of life support. So society has to be calculated, and the same way we calculate like heat that passes into a building as a measurement of cubic feet, this same interconnected application needs to be applied to our social system. An economy is about being holistically functional in all aspects, from maintaining maximum efficiency, such as design efficiency to ensure product durability, and eliminating needless duplicity by allowing to put every single person in the process of product creation. So distribution efficiency, localized, fast, reliable, with minimum energy usage. Like, what we're getting shirts made in sweatshop factories in China and shipping them all across the ocean over here, which waste like as much energy as I think it's like 45 million cars. Every big freight ship waste. That's how much gas it uses, to bring things across back and forth. And why is that? Because property is cheap over there, and also the labor is cheap over there. Whereas in reality we could localize everything here, we save a lot of energy. But again, it's not factored into our economic process because we're within the market paradigm. And when it comes to decision making, we can adapt our economic model to the natural world by learning how a nervous system works. So our human body, what does that do? It functions through dynamic feedback. Our sensory system is tied into the central processing system, which is the brain, and information is delivered from the external world to our internal management system, and triggers immediate action and trigger responses such as releases of chemicals and functions of our organs. And in an RBE, the same system's perspective, the same system's interaction is taken in, where direct and immediate feedback is allowed for quick decisions such as production, inventory, and transportation of key resources during a crisis. So when we have an incorporated system of earthly resource management within the intent of sustainability at hand, then we see that the full surveillance of every ecosystem as well as the observation of human affairs can be legitimized. The same way our bodies maintain equilibrium with the natural world by removing waste, the same thing is done with the resource management system. And a good example of this like direct feedback, automatic process, is a cellular repair of trees in our skins. This can be applied towards the repairing of infrastructure. So, if a part of a house's wall in the future is damaged, the technical nervous system recognizes it, and like the cells of an organism, the wall membrane will begin to automatically seal itself in and repair the crack. No need for somebody to come in there, call somebody to repair it. It'll be done automatically, like a nervous system. So we need to have a instant reactions to our global changes, and this is done again through nervous system scanning for the following, such as industrial output, health of the environment, food production rate, population pressures, and ecological footprint, as well as inventory of the non-renewable resources. Another aspect of the natural world to take into consideration is evolution and adaptation. In nature, nothing is ever fixed, and all systems are undergoing constant change. Human society must also undergo fluid change, both technologically as well as culturally. So this is the most important point I want to make right now, is that we don't want a society that's stuck in cultural lag, engaging in patterns of behavior that are obsolete. In nature, mechanisms that are obsolete in providing survival to a species are overridden. So the same thing has to be applied to our social system. This is the adaptive element of nature that we can learn from. That when it comes to cultural memes, no ideology should ever be frozen in time. Education plays an important role in this, and what we would have in a resource-based economy is that, socially relevant information would be made available to the public at all times. Not, propaganda that's served to meet the needs of the 1%. The same way our bodies produce biological information in the form of biological signals along our cells and our neural pathways, not only will a technical sensory system carry signals to the central processing station of a given city, social statistics can be carried out through social media to the public, allowing for a true democratically interactive interface. And if we were to use a systems approach of combining the advanced food production, advanced energy production, manufacturing, transportation, and water purification systems, we would arrive at what's called by Buckminster Fuller as the omni-integratable potentiality, where the efficiency is maximized multiple-fold, and much more than if we were to focus on one specific system. So nature's amazing ability to regenerate, purify, and renew resources comes from the vast interconnections between all of its systems, of its subsystems. So we have a lot to benefit from mimicking this process of nature, and we would finally have economic self-regulation and a state of balance. Therefore, this model can be best described as an omni-integratable system which is democratically engaged by the public through a holistic set of input processes, while also filtering all actions through what we could call the sustainability and efficiency protocols. And this brings me to the final point of system limitation. When it comes to cultural philosophies, the human population, we have to also gain a clear comprehension of our limitations and derive our values from the physical reality. So there are obviously natural limitations, even in a world of abundance, in terms of human wants or needs. So therefore, no matter what we think about ourselves, our intentions or freedoms, once placed into the system interaction of physical law, we are bound to the system indefinitely. So therefore, we must align with the inherent logic of functioning within these natural limits. So, and if we choose to ignore or fight these pre-existing rules, we will invariably decrease social stability and ecological stability, and that's what's really going on in our world today, is a clear overshoot. So the TZM text puts it very well when describing this new value system. It states, the awareness of natural limitations, as we have come to understand them today via the scientific method, express perhaps the most profound shift in human values and loyalties in history. Our range of possibility within the boundaries of the governing laws of nature also reveals an ever-increasing technical efficiency and incredible potential to create an abundance to meet human needs globally. And I'm going to move to my final statement regarding the value system of understanding the systemic interconnections between all of us. Our psychology and our character traits are developed through interactions between our environment, our genes, and character traits, and repeated experiences. We are more socially mediated than ever before, so we can use this collective consciousness in ways that are constructive and innovative, bringing positive energy influence into the world. And one of the main arguments that I get from people regarding shifting values is that this is too hard, it'll never be done, I can never do this, I have to work for my own job and my own family and my friends and my social status. I'll just say to that, my answer to that would be, doesn't mean you have to give up your whole life and just go off into living in the woods and creating a dome-shaped structure and doing lectures the rest of your life. No, actually the first step, really for everybody, is not to go around lecture and do these communicative projects. If you actually are, you receive information from somebody who's actually trying to reach out to you, if you actually just research on your own and accept these recognitions of cooperation, like Harry said, against competition, synergistic aspects of symbiotic nature of things instead of the divisionary aspects of our economy, that's actually the most important step. Recognition of these foundational premises, which are very simple things, but obviously complex to the average person. They think it's really complex, but it's really simple. So recognition comes a long, long way. And that really is the first step and the most important step, as far as I'm concerned, towards creating the change that we need to see in the world, and hence creating a system, a way of movement, of social thought, where we become the leaders. And that's what I'm going to leave off with today. And that's basically becoming the change we wish to see in the world. Thank you very much.